Hello everyone, my name is Marne Titchenell. I am the Extension Program Specialist in Wildlife in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, which is part of the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. I'm glad you decided to join me for this video, and I look forward to seeing you virtually during the September 11th Day in the Woods program. So today we are going to be talking a little bit about the impacts of non-native invasive species on wildlife. Ready? Let's get started.
I wanted to start by looking at some larger impacts of non-native invasive species. So annual losses to the Great Lakes region due to ship-borne invasive species is at least 200 million. We see that out west, leafy spurge is costing ranchers roughly 144 million a year, and efforts to control purple loosestrife are costing about 45 million. So the estimated damage from non-native invasive species worldwide totals close to 1.4 trillion, which is 5% of the global economy. Bringing it a little bit closer to home, when we look at the United States, we're looking at 120 billion, with over 100 million acres being affected. And just a statistic for Ohio that maybe you're not aware of, many of our invasive, non-native invasive species are impacting our natural areas, namely our forests. And we have a very healthy forest products industry here in Ohio, and it adds 22 billion to our economy. So when it comes to wildlife, invasive species are one of the leading threats. 42% of threatened and endangered species are at risk primarily due to invasive species. Okay, so invasive species are one of the leading threats. What is the top threat to our wildlife populations? Loss and degradation of habitat. Now, I would argue that invasive species contribute to the loss and degradation of habitat. So they're very closely entwined with that primary threat to wildlife populations. Now, I do want to explain before we go any further that there are many examples I could share with you today on the impacts of invasive non-native species on wildlife. I do have a background in forestry, so a lot of the examples will be related to and occurring in forest ecosystems. But I wanted to make you aware that there are impacts occurring in many of our ecosystems, and I would encourage you to continue to learn about some of those effects and impacts as well. So we're going to look at an example that is near and dear to my heart because during my graduate research at The Ohio State University, I was studying bat populations in our oak hickory forests. And in fact, they meaning foresters at the time, were implementing harvests in order to regenerate oak species. So right now in Ohio, if you're not familiar with the situation, oak regeneration is low in our forests, meaning we're not seeing as many seedlings, oak seedlings in the floor as we would like. And one of the biggest reasons is due to a lack of disturbance that historically was present. Many of our oak forests are closed canopy, which means there's very little light reaching the forest floor. And oaks need light to grow well, but other species like maples don't. They're perfectly happy living under a closed shady canopy. Now, one of the ways that we can allow more light to the forest floor to encourage oak regeneration is to reintroduce disturbance into the landscape. And now that disturbance could be a controlled burn or harvesting of some trees. The intent, of course, is to remove some of those overstory trees, namely through harvesting, as well as the understory trees, which in the case of Ohio are often maples. Okay, and so that would be removing the competition that the maples are giving the oak seedlings, and then allowing those oak seedlings to get more sunlight. Okay, so just laying out the situation there for you that we're dealing with our oak forests now. So then you throw in competition from invasives. Okay, so on top of all of this, along comes an invasive species. In this example, we're going to be talking about buckthorn. Now, the seeds from buckthorn generate 2 weeks faster and with a higher success rate in oak forests. Okay, now, of course, our oak forests are critical from the wildlife perspective. Acorns are an invaluable food source, especially for these species. But unfortunately, non-native invasive species are quite good at their job, okay, which is colonizing new areas and spreading from there. So we as natural resources professionals and landowners, we really need to be diligent in our management of them. And I know that is a big statement. It's difficult to do, but we have to remember that what is on the forest floor is the future forest. And what kind of a future forest would we have when the understories are choked with garlic mustard, Japanese barberry, honeysuckle, or tree of heaven? Invasive plants do not provide the resources that our native plants do for wildlife. And when it comes for wildlife, they're looking for food and they're looking for cover resources from our plants. Let's look at this arrowwood viburnum as an example. It is supplying cover and or food to each of the species that you see below. Can privet or buckthorn or honeysuckle do the same? Well, in the research I share with you today, you will learn that in most cases the answer is no. Invasive plants are inferior resources for wildlife when compared to our native plants. Let's look at this example. We're going to be looking at lepidopterans, which are comprised of butterflies, moths, and skippers. So this is an important group of animals as they serve many roles as herbivores, pollinators, and prey. They're also closely tied to certain plants, as many species of butterflies and moths and skippers prefer certain plants to lay their eggs on. So that means that their diversity and abundance is also a good indicator of plant diversity. So in this research that I'm going to share with you, the researchers were examining pollinator diversity in honeysuckle invaded areas, and they found that the diversity decreased in these areas. Okay, specifically, spring caterpillar and summer butterfly diversity both declined, which is not surprising when you lose plant diversity. Again, a lot of times our insects do respond negatively to that lack of diversity. In another study, they were looking at kind of the same story, but with privet. The good news is when they removed privet, it increased the diversity and abundance of butterflies, and they were also looking at native bees in this study. Now, lepidopterans are just one of many arthropod communities being impacted by invasive species. And it's these arthropod communities that play essential roles in maintaining ecosystem functions and health, especially in the case of pollinators, like this little native bee that impacts populations of black bears, squirrels, white-tailed deer, and songbirds. And it does that by pollinating the dogwood and then, of course, providing food in the form of berries to those wildlife species. So in a 2014 study, researchers reviewed 87 articles that evaluated the response of arthropod communities to non-native invasive plants. And they reported that total abundance of arthropods decreased in 62% of the studies, and that richness, which is a measure of diversity, decreased in 48% of the studies. Now, of course, the arthropods themselves are not always innocent, right? Non-native invasive species cross many taxa, including insects. So hemlock woolly adelgid is a small insect that poses a significant threat to the health and sustainability of our hemlocks. So if you look at that map on the left side, the range of the eastern hemlock, which is the tree that this adelgid is impacting, is in green, and then the yellow counties are where the hemlock woolly adelgid, HWA, has been discovered. Okay, so this adelgid is a very small insect. It's primarily transported by wind, infested nursery stock, and unfortunately, it can hitch a ride on birds. So I want to talk a little bit about how HWA is impacting some of our songbird populations. And if you didn't realize, we do have some species of songbirds that are hemlock specialists, which means that they prefer hemlocks and the forest community that you have when you have a forest dominated by hemlocks. So they're not alone. These species that you see here, nearly 90 species of birds use hemlock forests. But as I said, several are specialists. If you've ever stood beneath a hemlock, you would have noticed how its beautifully dense canopy just creates this wonderful, cool and shady spots, and the birds definitely appreciate that too. So if you've been looking at these, maybe you're a birder, you've been quizzing yourself. We have the blue-headed vireo right there. Next we have the Blackburnian warbler, and one of my favorites, the black-throated green warbler. In areas where HWA has invaded, changes in bird communities are being reported. So this research is from Delaware and New Jersey. And they reported that our hemlock bird specialist, such as the black-throated green warbler, has been declining across the stands. I'm just going to tangent a little bit because, as I said, this is one of my favorite warblers. It's the first warbler call I ever learned. For some reason, the mnemonic ZZ Zuzuzi really stuck in my head, so I'll just play that for you. So maybe that'll stick in your head, and the next time you're walking through a hemlock forest, if you hear that, you'll know what it is. But again, this is one of the species that started showing declines when hemlock woolly adelgid arrived. But while the specialist declined, other species increased, such as, this guy's playing again, sorry about that, he wasn't done singing. So other species in these same stands were increasing. The eastern wood pewee, the hooded warbler, and the wood thrush. So the decline of hemlock bird specialists along with the decline of hemlocks is obvious. But what explains the increase in other species? The answer has to do with how the physical structure of the forest was changed after hemlocks declined. So as hemlocks die, more light penetrates the canopy, reaching the forest floor. This results in understory vegetation growth and the release of deciduous trees that were hanging out under the canopy of hemlocks. Now they're receiving a good dose of sunlight and really starting to grow. So after time, the once hemlock-dominated forest looks very different. So this change in both forest structure and composition is now favorable to different bird species. Those that like the shrub layer of the forest, like the hooded warbler. Those that favor forest edges, like the eastern wood pewee. And those that prefer mature deciduous forests, like the wood thrush. So that explains why we saw this increase in a different bird community. Now, perhaps some of you are saying, well, okay, we're losing our hemlock specialist bird species, but we're gaining these other species. That's good, right? Well, I encourage you to think about it. Every species out there is important, And by losing the specialists, we are losing biodiversity, which is not something we want to see. Now, the good-ish news is that to these hemlock bird specialists, an unhealthy hemlock is still better than no hemlock. So as trees are able to be treated to increase their lifespan, it really is critical that infestations are detected early. In the long term, however, replacement of hemlock stands by deciduous forests or maybe even communities dominated by invasive, non-native plants is most likely going to lead to less diversity out there in both our plant and our wildlife communities. Similar studies have found changed or declined bird communities in emerald ash borer infested stands and honeysuckle invaded stands. Unfortunately, this is a very common ecological response when non-native invasive species are introduced into new areas. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about some impacts of invasive plants on wildlife. And we are once again going to focus on the songbirds. This research has been out for some time, and maybe you've heard of it already, but we've known for a while that the berries of some non-native invasive plants are not nutritionally valuable as our native plants. This is definitely true of non-native honeysuckle, and that's what you're seeing these two birds feasting on here, our American robin on the right and our cedar waxwing on the, our American robin on the left and our cedar waxwing on the right. So unfortunately, the honeysuckle in this case is doing its job rather well. It is producing a flush of brightly colored berries that bring in the birds. And of course, then those birds eat the berries and disperse the seeds across the landscape with a little bit of fertilizer, potentially contributing to the spread of this plant, of this non-native invasive plant. And so these pictures were taken by Jim McCormack, beautiful pictures. And he said in the relatively short period that I monitored their activities, they probably ate hundreds of berries. So we really do need to help the birds out, as they obviously don't realize that this is a poor food source. So we need to help them out and get those plants off the landscape as best we can. Now, what we just discussed is an example of something called an ecological trap. And that's something that looks appealing but ends up having negative effects, like the berries that appeared nutritious but really are not. Here is another example of an ecological trap. So research reported that wood thrush and American robins suffered higher rates of nest predation when they nested in honeysuckle and buckthorn. Cardinals were also having issues when nesting in honeysuckle. So what's the deal? What's going on? Well, it turns out that the early leaf out that we see with many of our non-native invasive species made for an appealing nest site. So say, for example, you are a cardinal and you've stayed in one area through the whole winter and you want to get a head start on the nesting season. And so you're looking around at a plant within the shrub layer because that is where you like to build your nests. You find these nice plants, as you see in that bottom picture there, that are greening up rather early, and you pick a spot and set up your nesting territory, and then of course you start singing to attract a lady. Okay. What ends up happening is that you're not the only cardinal doing that. Okay. A lot of other birds are seeing that early leaf out and thinking, hey, that looks like a great spot to build my nest. And so what ends up happening is a high concentration of nests in invasive shrubs that are leafing out early in the early part of the year, which nest predators like our raccoons, for example, clue in on and easily raid. Now, as the growing season continues and more nesting options, more shrubs, namely native ones, leaf out, the nests of our songbirds are better dispersed and nest predation impacts are lessened. But in the early part of the year, it's definitely an impact on our songbird nesting abilities. But that's not all. we're also seeing non-native invasive plants impacting reproductive strategies of cardinals. First of all, let's talk about why cardinals are red. It's partly due to their diet, specifically the carotenoid pigments found in berries. So in this research, cardinals in urban areas were found to have diets rich in honeysuckle berries. This research took place in central Ohio, and there is no shortage of honeysuckle in and around those cities and communities. So the honeysuckle berry diet gave the males this very bright red plumage. However, when they were tested, they were not as healthy as their plumage indicated. And perhaps you saw this coming, as we learned earlier that many of the berries from our non-native invasive species are not very nutritious. So what does this all have to do with reproductive strategies? Well, male cardinals use their bright feathers to attract mates, and to a female cardinal, a bright red male signifies a quality mate who is able to secure a good food supply. Of course, with these honeysuckle-loving cardinals, that's not the case. And so our bright feathers are no longer a sign of a high quality mate. Now, we don't know if there are any long-term impacts of this, but it's very interesting, and time will tell. Now, in the same study, the researchers also looked at cardinals in honeysuckle invaded rural areas. So the previous slide, we looked at urban areas. Now we're looking at rural areas. And they were assessing the cardinals' diets in those areas. And they did find that the brightest males were still the healthiest, as it should be. So they must have been finding enough other food sources that were keeping them healthy. However, those same bright males were producing fewer young. Why? Well, it turns out that they were nesting in invasive plants that leafed out earlier in the season. And we remember how that ended, right? Nest predation. I want to stress that this research was comparing urban and rural areas. And we can't assume that the ecological behaviors of plants and animals in urban areas are always going to be the same as they would in their natural habitats. And this is really important to realize when it comes to invasive species, as this study illustrates. And I want to give another example of how ecology in urban areas isn't always what we would expect. So we're going to stick with our songbirds and talk a little bit more about nesting success. This research, along with the research that I've already been presenting on our invasive plant impacts on songbirds, much of that research is out of Amanda Rodewald's lab, and this research is as well. So in this research, they were trying to determine if songbird nesting success and fledgling survival, so the young bird survival, differed between rural and urban areas. And so they had 35 mature forest sites. Again, I believe this is in central Ohio. And they were looking across a rural to urban gradient from 2001 to 2014, so a rather long-term study here. Now, a major factor dictating nesting success is nest predators. And so they recorded all potential nest predators and monitored their impacts on the nest. Interestingly, the central Ohio area was found to be the third most diverse community when it came to nest predators in the world. So 21 species were recorded, and you're looking at the top species that were nest predators within this study. So squirrels, crows, raccoons, and cats. Researchers also found in the study that as you moved closer to urban areas, all species of nest predators, except cowbirds, increased in numbers. So that's something important to keep in mind. So let's look at the results. Over 11 years, they looked at over 4,600 nests, so no small sample size here. Now, you might expect that with such a diversity and abundance of nest predators in the urban areas, that nesting success and fledgling survival in those areas would go down, right? Well, the results were not as we would expect. Nest predation did not increase in urban areas. In addition, the survival of fledglings was not impacted by whether or not the nest occurred in an urban area. Now, in rural areas, nest survival did go down with increasing predators, as we would expect, but not in urban areas. So what is going on? It turns out that most of those nest predators are generalists, meaning they're not too picky about where their food comes from and what they're eating. They can eat a lot of different things. And in urban areas, there are a lot of options for food. So for example, this is way easier than going up against that bill as you're trying to sneak an egg out of the nest. Okay, it makes sense when you think about it, but the results were definitely not what the researchers were expecting. So I think this brings up an important point. Within our urban ecosystems, there is a lot we still don't know. And with the prevalence of invasive species within our urban areas and the surrounding matrix, I think that adds a level of further questions and unknowns. So even if we think we understand how an invasive species impacts a wildlife species, we need to remember that the ecosystem that they are in may dictate what those impacts are, and that the outcomes are not always what we would expect. So thank you for letting me tangent away from forests and invasive species for a bit. I really do think that the study of urban ecosystems is important and very much needed right now. So I want to end this presentation with an example that shows how relationships between wildlife and invasive species are not always straightforward, like we've been discussing up until this point. So let's bring white-tailed deer into the picture. There's something you need to understand about deer if you don't already. Deer are selective browsers, which means that first, they're going to eat the tastier species and then leave behind the less tasty or less palatable species. So without an equal amount of browsing pressure on those less palatable species, those species are going to keep growing and increase in numbers while the preferred or tastier species disappear. And sometimes those less palatable species are non-native invasives, so not the ones that we want to increase in numbers. So in this study, that's pretty much what happened. If you're looking at this picture, maybe you can identify the browse line. But in this forest, there were very high deer populations, which led to over-browsing of the herbaceous layer to the point where it is essentially, as you can see in this picture, non-existent. Less palatable species were left behind, and it created a very disturbed understory. And if you know anything about invasives, they love to colonize disturbed sites, and that's what happened. And so here you see a picture of garlic mustard coming right on in and colonizing this site. So based on this research, you might think that the answer would be to remove the deer, really bring down those populations. Well, yes and no. It's not always that clear cut, as you will see in this next example. In Cade's Cove in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, they put up a deer exclosure to determine browse impacts. So a deer exclosure is a small fenced-in area that deer can't access. They can't get into it. This is commonly done to assess what will grow in an area when deer are not allowed to chow down. So in the national park here, on the outside of the fence, you can kind of see that in the middle, lots of vegetation going on in the inside of the fence, but on the outside, The white-tailed deer consumed saplings and seedlings and ended up reinforcing the dominance of Japanese stiltgrass. So kind of like we just saw happening with the garlic mustard in that last study. Now, on the inside of the fence, you'd expect all the seedlings and saplings deer can't reach to be happily growing, right? Well, again, not the case. Inside the fence, another invasive was happily growing, Multiflora rose. So deer had been keeping Multiflora rose in check before the fence went up. And they will consume Multiflora rose after they've eaten the more preferred species, thereby keeping its growth in check. So what is the answer? You need enough deer to keep some invasives in check, but the deer population should also be at a level that will not cause overbrowsing damage. Well, Indiana State Parks found the happy medium. Over 17 years of controlled deer hunts, they found that in their parks, the plant species richness, the diversity, and the herbaceous layers all increased, while the non-native invasive species decreased. That's what we want to see, right? So we have some pictures there that you're looking at. So A and B are the same site, and C and D are the same site. And I think if you look from A to B, the diversity is clear. A is before the deer hunts, and B is after. From C to D, it might be a little bit less clear. In that picture of C, it might look like there's a little bit more lush vegetation prior to the deer hunts. And that may be true, but it's mostly ferns, so it's not a very diverse understory. In picture D, there is a lot more diversity there, and you can even see some seedlings and some saplings coming back in. But here is the take-home message with this, again, a long-term study here. Here's the take-home message. It wasn't just hunting the deer that helped bring these forests back. It was also forest management. So some deer browsing ended up promoting understory plant diversity when combined with other disturbances. For example, controlled burns and harvesting. So that was a very important component, that forest management of this study. So in wrapping this up, I want to remind you that while I largely focused on non-native invasive plants today, invasive species cross many taxa, I often include feral swine and white-nose syndrome and the impacts on bats in with this topic of invasive impacts on wildlife, but I didn't want to make you sit at your computers any longer this time around. So if you would like more information on white-nose syndrome in bats, I have already done another webinar on Ohio bats and white-nose syndrome, and you can find it by going to that link below. There's also a feral swine fact sheet available at that link right there, woodlandstewards.osu.edu. If you're not familiar with Woodland Stewards, that is a program that I am involved in through the Ohio State University, where we do a lot of programming for woodland owners and really anybody interested in natural resources, specifically forests and wildlife and aquatics. So what can we do? What can we do to fight these non-native invasive species? Well, first, everyone needs to be on the same page when it comes to prioritizing invasive species management. We also need to realize that the majority of Ohio's forests are privately owned, which means landowners can play a really important role when it comes to managing our invasive species. And then folks in our urban centers, they're not off the hook either. They have a big role to play as well. The majority of us these days are living in our urban areas and really looking for ways to connect with nature within our cities. So we need to make responsible decisions when it comes to greening our communities as well. So I strongly believe that raising the awareness of the public and in engaging them and their energy into action is one of the most effective tools available to us. in this fight against invasive species. So I offer a sincere and big thanks to all of you for taking the time to listen to this talk and to learn about some of those impacts that our non-native invasive species have on our ecosystems. And big thanks if you are already working to manage invasive species on your property. I'm sure that some of you listening to this that have been involved in the Day in the Woods program, that you're already doing that. So big thanks and great job. Besides managing invasive species on your own property, another way you can help is to track these invasive species. So the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app is an app that does just that. It's really easy, it's really simple to use, and you can keep track of the invasive species on your property, or if you're out and about in Ohio, you can help us put these invasive species on the map. So the app is available in Android and iPhone versions. Myself and several coworkers, we just did a webinar on this app and how you can use it. And you can access that webinar right there at that link in the red box, again, on our Woodland Stewards website. And then do feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions in regards to that app. Just wanted to again show the Woodland Stewards website, specifically because if you go to our publications tab, you can find a nice list of fact sheets on non-native invasive plants. So it'll go through the identification and management of each of these plants if you need some help, or if you have questions on how to get those plants out of the environment and out of your woodlands. And there's my contact information. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about during this presentation, feel free to reach out to me. Email is the best way to get a hold of me these days. And I do hope to talk with you on September 11th. So feel free to bring your questions there as well. Thank you all very much for listening, and hope to see you soon.